Welcome to episode 316 of CppCast, the first podcast for C++ developers by C++ developers. I'm your host, Rob Irving, joined by my co-host, Jason Turner. Jason, how you doing today?
All right, Rob, how are you doing?
Doing okay. Not too much going on for me. You got anything going on you want to talk about?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we mentioned the conferences and stuff that I'm supposed to be doing, but at the moment, it is very difficult to tell whether or not I'm going to be allowed to go to Norway. I look at the news like every day.
I think I saw something about EU having, some countries banning Americans from travel again. Yeah.
Well, and the rules that have been changed is that they were allowing Americans in general in Europe who had a negative COVID test or a vaccine. Now they're saying, yeah, those countries are still open to you, but you must have a vaccine. That's not a problem for me. But then Norway seems to be saying right now, anyone with a vaccine can come in. But then they also say you must have a vaccine certificate with a QR code that our immigration officers can scan. We don't have that in the United States.
No, that is not what our vaccine cards look like. No QR code.
No, and there's no way for us to register in a verified system that would give them an app with a QR code. No way that I'm aware of. So I think I'm allowed in, but I can't get in. As far as I can tell is the current situation for NDC Tech Town. So we'll see.
How long do you have until NDC Tech Town to figure this out?
It's middle of October.
Middle of October.
It's literally the exact week before CppCon.
Right. Well, I hope you're able to figure that out. I hope you're able to travel.
Yeah, I just kind of want to know at this point.
Yeah.
That'd be better than not knowing.
Okay. Well, at the top of every episode, I like to hear a piece of feedback. We got this comment from Mersage on the Include Discord. He wrote, potentially interesting guest might be Christian Trott. He's the lead on the Cocos Performance Portability Library at Sandia National Lab. His group is involved with various standardization efforts like MD-SPAN and the async concurrency parallelism stuff. And yeah, we've had a couple developers from the various national labs on before recently, but not had anyone on from Sandia, and I've never heard of this Cocos library. Have you?
I mean, it feels like it rings a bell, but I don't know. It's also interesting to point out, you mentioned the national labs, but I think they've all been specifically Department of Energy national labs, which is just a fascinating aside. But, like the DoD labs and stuff probably are less likely to be working on open source stuff that they can share with the rest of the world.
That's true. Okay, well, we'd love to hear your thoughts about the show. You can always reach out to us on Facebook, Twitter, or email us at CppCast or feedback@cppcast.com. And don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes or subscribe on YouTube. Joining us today is Phil Nash. Phil is the original author of Catch 2, a regular speaker at conferences, trainer, organizer of C++ on C and the C++ London Meetup, co-host of CppChat and No Diagnostics Required podcast, and recently moved to Sonar Source as a developer advocate. More generally, he's an advocate for good testing practices, TDD, and using the type system and tools and functional techniques to reduce complexity, increase correctness, and is not afraid of ABI breaks. Phil, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Rob. It's been a while, so nice to be back.
Hey, Phil, and I don't mean this as a dig to you personally, because it's also a question I have for myself. You're the original author of Catch 2, but it's been how many years now since you've maintained it?
Me personally, probably about 4 years, maybe.
So at what point do you remove it from your bio? And I'm asking because I still have ChaiScript on my bio, but I haven't maintained it in a couple of years either.
Well, that's why I include the word original author in there. And that's the big of a change, so it's evergreen.
That's true.
That's very true. All right. Well, Phil, we got a couple news articles to discuss. Feel free to comment on these, and we'll start talking more about what you've been up to. Okay?
Okay.
All right. So this first one is a link to another podcast. This is episode 39 of ADSP, which is Connor Hoekstra and Bryce Lullback's podcast. And it's how Steve Jobs saved Sean Parent. And the first thing I'll say, I did listen to this episode. It was a very entertaining story, but I really like the way that Bryce and Connor are doing their podcast episodes, because they seem to have squeezed 3 episodes out of one interview with Sean Parent. It's brilliant. They must have had him on for 2 hours, but like the first episode was, talking about the same thing we talked about him with the ST Lab, and then they have 2 episodes of just story time with Sean.
And story time with Sean's always a good opportunity if you manage to go out to lunch with him or something.
Yeah.
There's a hint of a story in, I think at the beginning of this episode, where he says, no, that's a story that has to happen at a bar over drinks.
Yeah.
Right. There was one story he wasn't willing to go on with on the podcast, but yeah, the story he did tell about his time working for an Apple reseller and a car, a very expensive, fancy car. I mean, I don't want to like ruin the whole thing for listeners, I guess, but it's certainly worth listening to.
It's definitely a story about how he deals with crashes.
I appreciated at the very end when he's like, unfortunately he never got the chance to tell Jobs the story, but has told Woz the story. Mm-hmm. And both Bryce and Connor were like, what? You got to tell Wozniak the story? And it's true. Like, Woz is one of those guys that if I had the opportunity to sit down and have a beer with, I would definitely do that.
Yeah, that'd be very cool.
I was actually surprised at Connor's restraint in not making "that's a rotate" jokes. I thought would have got in quite nicely.
Oh God, that's a good point.
That's terrible.
Yeah,
that is absolutely terrible.
And again, without spoiling the story, it is quite a scary story, serious matter actually. But it did make me think it's amazing that we actually make it through to adulthood at all. Given how even someone that seems as sensible as Sean Parent can have that type of story. I've got a few stories like that of my own, which I don't have time to go into now. So maybe you need to get me back on as a serial guest to tell those.
I've had a couple of very similar scary situations when I was driving that did not involve an actual accident. Like I lucked out seriously. So, yeah. I
do wonder, the story does kind of revolve around this promotion that Apple did to incentivize people to sell their computers. And, you don't hear about those sorts of promotions anymore. No one's giving out cars anymore. I wonder if like this situation specifically, the story ended that, or, other similar events. Who knows? Maybe
when the Apple car arrives.
Okay. Next thing we have is a blog post from Bungie, and this is Bungie C++ guidelines and razors. And I thought this was a pretty good article talking about what their C++ coding guidelines are like, and this idea of razors to kind of organize, and provide guidelines for creating the guidelines. I thought was a neat idea.
I actually thought that of the two, this was the more dangerous post that you linked to.
How so?
Well, when we talk about coding guidelines, it's always a sensitive topic among developers. But I thought they did actually cover it well. The idea being that, you want to start off with consistency, and you may as well be consistent with something that's well reasoned. And I thought, even if I didn't entirely agree with all of the points, you could at least see the rationale behind them and get behind that. So that was my main takeaway from that.
I kind of, there's like, I don't know, 8 points in here or something, 6. Mm-hmm. And I got slowed down on point number 2, because they say to prefer, one of their guidelines is that they generally prefer post increment over pre-increment for readability. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I know I've done an episode about this. And so now I'm searching through my own YouTube list, and no, as far as I can tell, I haven't done an episode about it. But post increment, generally speaking, is illogical. It's generally speaking not the thing that you actually mean in your code. You don't mean increment the value and then return the old value back to me. That's almost never what we actually mean. So I have to do an episode now. That's all.
Yeah. One of the things I saw here was leverage visual consistency, and I've never seen this suggestion before, but they have to not leave a space to the left of the assignment operator
Yeah,
to visually distinguish from the comparison operator.
that was
And
totally.
I don't know if I would change to use that, but I definitely see what they're going for, and it does help
I had a similar
to
thought.
differentiate.
That one caught my eye as well. If you look at languages that use the colon operator instead of equals for assignment, it has a very similar feel to that. That may be where it's coming from.
Yeah, I kind of saw it in my like mental parser, kept expecting to see another token to the left of the assignment. I'm like, is that an ampersand? Oh no, that's a D. But yeah, but it did give you that feel, like a colon equals kind of feel.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say I like it, but I also wouldn't say I have anything against it.
Yeah.
Probably just take time to get used to it.
Anything else we want to highlight before we move on?
I was just thinking, depending on what industry you're in, what you do, you rarely appreciate that they're talking about a code base that's, what do they say, over 20 years old? And they're maintaining N different versions of it simultaneously and fixing bugs in a release that's 2 revisions back and having to constantly keep the code in a state where they can forward port those bug fixes. That definitely puts some sobriety to the thought of like, oh, well, you just need to do a modernization of the whole code base. Well, no, we couldn't do that. They couldn't do that reasonably because they wouldn't be able to forward port these bugs without a huge amount of pain. Or, forward port the fixes, not the bugs. You generally don't try to forward port the bugs. But anyhow, just, something else to think about. Other projects have to deal with complicated things.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing they talked about, how they will have like maybe 3 or 4 branches running at the same time, like one for the most recent update and then the next 2 updates, which might not release for months, if not a year. But anytime a bug fix is made on like the most recent or the current branch, it'll automatically get merged into the other 2 active branches. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. But that also means you just can't ever do a large
Right.
refactoring. Not really.
Yeah.
That would make me sad.
Maybe you need to get them on the show to talk about that.
Maybe we should.
Yeah.
Have you ever played the Destiny
Maybe we
games?
should get them on CppChat.
I played the first one. I have not played Destiny 2.
I have not played any of them.
Yeah.
Do you still have, is CppChat still a podcast, Phil?
It is. We'll get to that. Jump ahead.
All right. Well, Phil, obviously we mentioned in your bio a couple changes that have happened recently. Where do you want to start?
Right. Well, to begin with, I've been on this show. I counted them up 3 2/3 of the time before, like 3 full-time
3
episodes, and
Right.
a couple of times I was sharing it with other people. The last full appearance was on 10th of May 2018, so nearly over 3 years
been a
ago now.
while. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And that was when we were just kicking off the reboot of CppChat, which is still going, although, yes, it has been very quiet over the last year. In fact, we did a couple of episodes in the same week, actually, back in May, I think it was, this year. The idea was, we're going to get going again, and then it sort of burnt out. There are reasons for that, mostly just the all the extra pressures of these pandemic times on both myself and John for conferences, and then my job change, which we'll also get to, have all been factors. But they're just excuses, really. We need to get back on the wagon, and we definitely have plans to do that. But I don't want to jinx it again by making any promises. But no, we have plans there. But in that time, we've also started yet another podcast, which we did mention in the bio. No diagnostic required, or NDR, which I'm doing with Anastasia Kazakova, my now former colleague from JetBrains, but we're still doing the podcast.
Cool.
And that's a monthly podcast. And we've actually been keeping to that, even if sometimes it slipped into the next month. We've actually kept to the monthly schedule. And I think, as you know, keeping to that regular schedule is the important thing. And we never really set that for ourselves too strictly with CppChat, so it was easy to to let that slip a bit. But no diagnostic required. It's a bit of a different show. It's just the two of us talking about the current news in the community. So a bit of a different feel. A little bit easier in terms of organising and editing as well. And then the other thing I mentioned...
You also post on YouTube, right?
Sorry?
That one you also post on YouTube, because I watched one or two episodes of it and saw that you actually have visuals, right?
Yeah, that's another thing that's slightly different. It's it is very visual. Well, we have slides. It's a bit more, almost like a talk that makes sense when you see it on YouTube. But what I also do is when I come to edit it, I put chapter markers in the podcast audio. So if you have a podcast player that can display chapter art, you'll actually see the slides in your podcast player. So even the audio podcast has the visuals. That turns out to be a lot more work than I'd signed up for. So got to reconsider whether we'll keep that going in both formats. But it works quite well, I think. So it is a nice idea. The other thing that I mentioned in that last episode back in 2018 was that I was just about to start C++ on C.
Right.
Yes.
The conference. We've now had 3 editions. 2, of course, have been online, including the last one just a few months ago. So probably talk a little bit more about that later, but that's also still going. And of course, I've moved to Sonar Source, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more next.
Well, I guess let's talk about that. How long has it been since you joined Sonar Source as a developer advocate?
So I started there beginning of June this year. So it's just a few months. And it's been quite an interesting time starting in a new place. The onboarding process is fairly unique, actually. Very slow start. The first month or so, you're not really expected to do any actual work. It's really about taking the time to absorb yourself in the company culture, the nature of your work, which is a bit awkward in my case because I'm actually the first developer advocate there. So there's nobody that says, right, this is what a developer advocate does here. So of course I had to bring that with me. But yeah, I've taken the time to get to know the products a bit more deeply, work with the team, and get to know the company culture, which is actually a lot more in depth than it sounds. There's a very strong culture there with lots of very interesting principles and philosophies that are all designed to try to keep this sort of small company feel as the company scales up and grows. And so far it's, I think it's 200 to 300 people, still growing very rapidly. So it's not a small company anymore, but it does have that small company feel. So far it's working. It's really good, but it takes a while to really get to that. So now at this point, I'm actually starting to do some real work, and it's very similar in that sense to what I was doing at JetBrains as a developer advocate there. Different as well. And when I'm talking about JetBrains, just wanted to address one thing, because I know I do get asked this. The trouble with a job like this, where it is very public, when I change jobs, people will be asking, why? What was wrong with JetBrains?
Right.
And the answer is nothing. There's nothing wrong with JetBrains. It was a great job. I love the products. I still use them all the time. And I still have some great friends there.
And you're still podcasting with Anastasia, right?
Exactly, yes. So no bridges are burnt. But the JetBrains job was great. But I felt it's sort of divided into two broad areas. So one was what I call the productivity features. So just making best use of an IDE to get things done, everything at your fingertips, getting stuff just done more quickly, which is great, but not so much the thing that I was passionate about. Whereas the other side of it is more of the code insight, what it actually tells you about the code. Part of that is static analysis, of course, that tells you on the fly what you're doing wrong or may be doing wrong next. That was the part that I was actually much more passionate about. And this move sort of gives me a chance to do something very similar, but more focused on that. So that's really what it was all about. So wanted to clear that up.
Well, how long were you at JetBrains?
Or if I was still there now, it would have been about 5 years next week.
Okay. So as someone who's never kept a regular job for more than 4 years, you change jobs after, almost 5 years. I wasn't going to ask, just for the record. I think, it's time for a change every now and then. I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
But it is good to hear. I like the idea that you're moving into a role where you get to focus on the things that you're more passionate about.
Yeah.
And also, it sounds like they might have made a smart decision if they've never had a developer advocate there to bring someone in who already brought that breadth of experience with them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the idea is that we will take on more developer advocates a little down the line as we expand that.
I feel like with the general role of conferences and social media and YouTube and all these things in the programming world, every company is going to need at least one developer advocate at some point. Every company that works in this product space. It's right. It seems like an important role, really.
Yeah, and from my experience in developer relations, the more general sphere, there are really two types of role. There's the type of company like JetBrains and Sonar Source that have products that developers use. There's a limited number of those, really.
Right.
But it's an obvious case there. But the other type is particularly services that have an API. And it's all about getting developers to use the API better. That's probably the more common type, actually. Most of the people I meet in developer relations are doing something more like that. So it's actually quite rare to find somebody else that's working with products.
Do you have like a secret club with a handshake and everything for everyone that works in developers?
I forget what the handshake is, but yes, yeah.
So we should, for a moment, talk, I guess, a bit more about Sonar Source. We did have Loic, who I guess is one of your coworkers now, a couple months ago. But do you want to tell us a little bit more about what the Sonar Source tools are that you're going to be working with and advocating for?
Yeah, actually, I work very closely with Loic now. So it's, it was quite interesting listening to that episode, knowing that I was just about to move there. So I got to meet him beforehand. But yeah, so I try not to cover too much of what Loic covered before. If you want to find out more, go back and listen to that episode. But we do have 3 products: Sonarlint, Sonar Cube with a Q, and Sonar Cloud. And out of the box, Sonarlint works pretty much like any other linter that you might already be familiar with. Plugs into your IDE, works either as you type or on save, depending on which IDE it is, just to scan your code, find issues, very much like warnings in your compiler. Often potential issues, like what we call code smells, things that may lead to an issue a bit later. But catches them as you introduce them, which is really the main benefit. So before you even commit stuff, you can fix these issues. So it's very similar to any other linter that you might find. And we're quite proud of the quality of what we call rules, which are like the warnings. And not just the range of warnings or rules that we offer, but the level of detail in the reporting and the contextual information that you get when you do hit them. It really gives you a lot more background and the rationale. Some of them read more like pages out of effective C++ or something like that. It's actually a great learning resource, just actually looking at some of these rule descriptions. So just on its own, that would be, I think, quite a compelling product, even though there are many competitors. But where it really levels up is when you use that in combination with one of the other products. Generally only one or the other, because they sort of serve the same role. So Sonar Cube is a server app. Well, they're both server applications, but Sonar Cube is one that you host yourself on your own hardware or your own premises, whereas Sonar Cloud is a hosted service that is hosted by Sonar Source. And at first impression, it does appear that Sonar Cloud is just like a hosted version of Sonar Cube, but they're actually different products, and they do have slightly disjoint feature sets. They're sort of more tailored to different purposes. In particular, Sonar Cube lets you have third-party plugins, and has some extra features on top, more for enterprises, so it scales up a bit more in that respect. But they're basically serving the same sort of purpose, which is to act as like a dashboard for basically all of your quality reporting. So it's not just the analyzers, the linters, but you can actually run sort of code coverage tools, test output, and even other third-party tools you can adapt into our own format to appear in this dashboard altogether. And it's a great way of keeping on top of that. And as I say, you've got those enterprise features on top if you want sort of governance over that as well. But even then, it goes further when those tools work together. So if you're using Sonarlint on your own desktop in your IDE and you're running SonarQube or Sonar Cloud, it can operate in what's called connected mode. So it knows about the server component, talks to it, and you can have all of your settings and configuration centrally managed on the server and synchronized across your whole team or even your whole company. So you only need to set it up once in one place. And you can even do things like, if you have one of those really annoying warnings that you think, well, yeah, this doesn't apply in my case, let's disable it. Rather than having to clutter your code up with annotations, you set it on the server side, and that actually propagates through even to the desktop linter. That's actually quite nice. It's one of the things that I wasn't sure of at first until I actually saw it. And then we have what we call clean as you code. Again, another big thing that I often hear about is if you want to use even high warning levels, let alone going to a linter, is, yeah, but my code that I've been writing for the last 20 years has thousands or millions of issues. I'll never be able to get through them. It'll just be noise. The idea behind clean as you code is it'll only show you new issues. So anytime you add or change code, that's when you get the warnings, and you keep the new code clean. And over time, the code that has the highest churn rate will become the cleanest. And the code that's just sitting there working, even if it has some warnings attached to it, you don't worry about those so much. Of course, you can still dig in and have a look at what might be there as well, but you don't have to. And that's really a nice way of working. So, so where those things all work together, I think, is the real value add.
So, Sonarlint is the user side of things, right? That's what you're talking about. Yeah. So, of course, I have to ask, how well does it work with CLion?
Mm-hmm. So, it's a funny story there, because just before I left JetBrains, we heard that Sonarlint was starting to support CLion. There was a plugin that they were just testing out, and they sent us across a version to try out before it went public. And at this point, I already knew that I was probably moving to Sonar Source, so I deliberately sort of kept out of the discussion because it just felt a bit awkward. But yeah, so we do now have a plugin for CLion. It's working quite nicely, and it was one of the first things that I got up and running when I did join.
So something that I'm curious about, because CLion has its own static analysis linting hinting things that it can give you, and the Clang Tidy integration is excellent there. If I've got Clang Tidy turned on in my project, I've got CLion's linter turned on, and I've got Sonarlint, like, do they play nicely together, or am I going to be sad that I turned them all on?
So the simple answer is yes. There is a but. It is early days. There are still a few clashes, but we're working through those. Okay. But Sonarlint itself. So Sonarlint is a cross-language product. And within Sonarlint, you have plugins for different languages. So there's what we call the C family plugin. So it's C, C++, and Objective-C. And that part's all written in C++ on top of Clang. Okay. So we get a lot of the Clang-based warnings already, some of the Clang Tidy ones, and we map them to our own descriptions, which can potentially sometimes be a bit richer, but we take into account all of those to begin with. Of course, then we have all our own rules on top of that, and then CLion has its own inspections, and yes, sometimes there are some clashes. We are trying to minimize those, because that can be annoying, but that's just a quality of implementation.
Sure.
I am interested why Objective-C is grouped with C and C++. It has
I was wondering why
syntax.
I was wondering why C# wasn't part of the C family.
Oh yeah, if you're gonna
call it
C
that
family, maybe that should be in there too. But yeah, why is Objective-C?
It's because the C family plugin, say it's built on Clang, so this is what Clang supports.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
We get almost the Objective-C stuff almost out of the box. We just have to write a little bit on top of that. It's not a big part of the product focus. It's mostly about C++, and of course some are specific to C.
Now, to be terribly pedantic, does that mean it also supports Objective C++?
I believe it doesn't.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure about that. I seem to remember that that's the case because, as I say, we are cross-language and we do have C#
Right.
plugin as well. And I'm pretty sure that one doesn't support C++ CLI for similar reasons. It just complicates because you've got a different way of doing the parse, I think. So you have to write completely. It'd be almost like a completely separate language.
And I don't think I actually know anyone who uses Objective C++ anyhow.
I have, but it's been a long time.
Sometimes.
You do sometimes? Okay.
Yeah. Well, I have done. Not for many years. In fact, Catch has Objective C++ in it.
Is that right?
Yeah. that was the original use case.
No, I don't know anything about the interoperability between Objective C and Objective C++, but why did you need Objective C++ instead of being able to implement that in C++ or C or Objective C or whatever?
Because originally I wanted a test framework for Objective C, and I wanted to write it in C++. And then Objective C++ was the way you make those languages interoperate nicely. So there's not that much to it, but it basically just lets you write Objective C and C++ in the same file with a little bit of crossover. It's actually a cleaner separation, I think, than the C++ CLI situation, which is a bit more deeply integrated.
And now, I'm sorry, but I have to ask Rob a question because you said you've also programmed in Objective C++. That's never come up before.
I certainly have. It's been a while. I was at my previous job where we did have an iPhone application that was shared code between our Windows Mobile and Android application, which was written in C++. So we had the top layer of the iPhone app had some Objective C++.
Alrighty then.
Yeah. I was going to say, you mentioned Catch again there for a moment. Yeah. So are you still contributing to Catch? We already said how you haven't been maintaining it for a few years.
So I'm no longer key maintainer, haven't been for a few years. I do occasionally contribute pull requests. Not that often these days. I think the last one was last year. And when I do, I just go through the usual process. Yeah, I maybe know Martin a bit more than most people, but it doesn't necessarily give me preferential treatment. In fact, sometimes it could be a disadvantage. And I think I mentioned the last time I was on that I spun the command line parser out of Catch, called it Clara, as a separate open source library, and started talking about it publicly and got quite a few people interested actually, which turned out to be a bad thing because then I ran out of time to really drive it forward. So ended up not actively maintaining it and eventually had to say, look, okay, open it up to the community, you can run with it. But by that point, Rene Rivera often comes up on forums and things as Graphic Robot. He made a fork of Clara that he called Lyra and did all those things that people have been asking for it to it, and seems to have been doing a great job with that since then. So if you want a good composable command line parser in the spirit of Clara, then check out Lyra. I'm sure we can get a link in the show notes. But it does mean that, I'm probably not going to start any new open source projects for a while because I don't think that'd be very responsible of me.
So how's that spelled? Like Lara or
Lyra?
I think I found it. I'll put this in the show notes.
This is funny because, some of us might spend years working on an open source project, dumping tons of time into it, hoping that someday it's going to take off or whatever. And then every now and then you do something like Clara, where you I intended to spend time on this, but then you throw it aside and someone else takes off and it becomes something, right?
Yeah.
My cousin had that happen, which I don't even know if we discussed this when we had him on the podcast, Rob, but he and I did CppChat together. But then when he was learning Rust initially, did Rye script just to learn Rust better. Apparently that project has taken off and it's like one of the most starred Rust projects. And all he did was get it going and toss it over the fence. And then a couple of years later, other people found it and picked it up and have been maintaining it for the last several years. So,
wow.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, we also mentioned earlier that C++ on C has been going strong for the past 3 years. Do you want to tell us how the 2021 conference went?
Yeah, so there's two sides to that. So in terms of execution, I think it went really well. It was a well-run conference, very smooth, and considering it's online, well over a year into doing online conferences, people are a little bit tired of that. I think we gave a compelling experience. That all worked quite nicely. What didn't work so well, I think, was just the attendance figures in the first place. It was enough to run a conference. It was successful as a conference, but it was about like half last year's figures. And I put a part of that down to, that just ongoing virtual event fatigue.
Pandemic burnout. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, tried a few different things to try and combat that. And I think they've ended up actually making it a little bit worse. Well, not worse, but just maybe didn't have the same numbers. Like in particular, we moved the classes, the workshops, which are usually like a bolt-on, separate days. We moved them into the main program. So when you buy a standard ticket, you're buying it for 2 days of workshops as well, and then a 1-day conference program. And if you look at it that way, it was excellent value for money. But if you look at it as, it's a 1-day conference, with these workshops bolted on, I think a lot of people looked at that and said, this is quite expensive. And so they gave it a miss. So maybe that's just a marketing issue. But the people that did attend really enjoyed it. They got a lot out of it. So I consider that a success. But I'm really looking forward to being able to get back to running things in person again.
Yeah.
So what is the situation currently like in England? Like, let's just say legally, could you host a conference tomorrow in person?
Yes, I believe we could. And in fact, ADC, the Audio Developers Conference, coming up in November, they are planning to run it's a hybrid conference, but primarily in person in London. So that's one to watch.
That's the one that what's the name of that project? Has a large presence there.
Juice.
Juice, right? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So yeah, that's looks like that's going ahead. The trouble is where we are right now. We're in this sort of window where things have been getting better for a while, with caveats, but as we come into the particularly the winter season, they may well go the other way. So it's very difficult to know what it's going to be like, even in November, but certainly by December. I'm really hoping that next year we're going to be in a better place, but I said that last year. I don't want to make that mistake again. So I don't know at this point. It's so hard.
I just saw a number. It was yesterday, and unsubstantiated. I can't qualify it or anything, but it was someone else quoting a report that they estimate 90% of Britons have either had COVID or are vaccinated. So theoretically, you're in a very good situation going into winter. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. In theory and practice are the same thing, but in practice they're often not.
Yeah.
Right.
I should be going to NDC Tech Town though. I had the opposite problem to you. Right. Norway should be fine, but getting to Denver for CppCon looks like that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I just have to drive a few miles east, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, the U.S., as far as I know, still doesn't announced any plans to allow tourism, which they need to at least announce. We need to announce our intentions. The government, needs to announce their intentions, if nothing else. That's getting annoying.
Yeah.
Any other plans for 2022 aside from hoping you can do C++ on C in person again? Yeah,
I think just the hope of a return to something we might call normal is the overriding fault. It's very difficult to think about anything else right now. I do hope that C++ on C can be probably a hybrid conference. So even if we're fully back to normal, I think we'd like to take advantage of what we learnt about running something online. But I'm not sure I want to do yet another purely online conference. But we'll see.
Well, I guess CppCon will be demoing that hybrid approach.
Yeah, and ADC, as I say, is also going to be hybrid.
Right.
Just pause for a moment. I feel like we maybe went a little bit too fast through some things. Do we want to talk more about Sonar Source or kind of go back and talk about anything else?
Or you did mention that we would get back to CppChat, I think.
Or we can talk about CppChat. Because I just noticed we were like getting to the end of the questions we prepared, but it felt like it's too early to close things out.
Yeah, I thought I was trying to fit too much in, so I may have rushed through it a bit too much.
No, it's fine. Do you want to talk CppChat then?
Yeah, can do.
Okay. You mentioned earlier, we talked about the various podcasts you're doing. What is the plans with CppChat? You said you'll be trying to get back going with it?
Yeah, as I say, there's been different constraints on our time. We just need to, I think establishing that regular schedule is really the key. So originally we were going to do it weekly, like yourselves. That turned out to be a bit of a strain, so I said, let's commit to 2 weekly. Even that seemed a bit much. So I think maybe slipping to monthly might be the right balance there, especially with no diagnostic required as well. So that's what we're going to try and do. I don't want to promise when we're going to start doing that because that seems to jinx it, but very soon. Maybe, probably not before CppCon at this point. But watch
I've learned
space.
that a great motivator is to put your frequency in the title of your thing. So just change it to CppChat quarterly, and then as long as you at least get 1 out per quarter, you've met your goals.
Well, we tried that because originally the tagline was strong opinions weekly held.
Okay, right.
Oh, nice.
Then it went to bi-weekly held. Running out of puns.
Yeah. We haven't talked to John for a while. I guess he has been pretty busy probably getting ready for CppCon. Yeah.
Yeah, although I did hear, and I don't want to speak too much for John, but I don't think he'll mind me saying this. Last year, his training was obviously took a bit of a hit in the pandemic, but this year, he's booked up for months in advance. So he's had very little time to do anything else. I think I can say that much.
Wow.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, I heard that comment from someone else that their remote training has been fully booked out. I've still managed to, I've turned down a lot of remote training opportunities because it's not what I'm interested in doing. What about you, Phil? Are you doing anything like that right now these days?
I am, in fact, at both NDC TechTown and CppCon. I'm going to be doing my accelerated TDD workshop, which will be 2 days at TechTown, and I think we're going to move it to the 3-day online at CppCon. It was originally the 2-day in person. And I've actually been finding that the online ones have worked fairly well for me. I miss being there in person, but in terms of how the content gets across, I actually think it works quite well. So I'm okay with that. I think different people have had different experiences, but I've heard quite a lot that delivering training online is actually a lot better than people have been thinking. Some people even prefer it. So I think that will continue to be a hybrid thing as well in the future.
Although I did hear some comments from people saying, sure, I'm happy to give my class online or in person, but a lot of people saying, no, I do not want a hybrid classroom.
Yeah, I should clarify. When I say hybrid, I don't mean a single session in both formats. I think most people agree that just doesn't work. The people who are online just get left behind.
Yeah.
So, no, it would be the same material presented either online or in person,
Right.
much as I'm doing at the moment. I think that will continue.
I've had a couple of scenarios where, I show up for the class and then they tell me, a couple of years ago, like, oh, well, Bob can't actually make it into the classroom today because his wife is sick or whatever, whatever, some scenario. So we're going to dial in the conference room into this. And so I'll end up with like 1 or maybe 2 students tops that are remote. And it's kind of funny because the conference room is dialed in. They can hear and see everything that I'm doing. And then every now and then it's like the voice of God asking a question because you forget that person's there. And so 1 or 2 students at a time, that's worked all right. But if it were like half of the class, I don't know how you would do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you run the class and even speak differently online versus in person, and
Right.
you just can't do that and cater to both audiences at the same time as well.
Right. So, give your best sell for this class before we let you go, for sure.
Yeah.
You just gave us the title of it, but you didn't tell what people will learn when they come to your class.
You're right, actually. Yeah, I did. I did promote it last time I was on, but I should do it again. So accelerated TDD, so TDD, test-driven development. So even if you've tried TDD before and thought, yeah, I don't know, it doesn't really work, or it's just extra hassle, probably because you were doing it wrong. So if you want to find out how to do it properly, I can recommend you some classes, or you can come to mine where I'll have an attempt at doing that as well. So the accelerated part is to try and get you through that initial hump where your productivity does go down before it comes back up, and that's where people usually give up. They think, hey, it's just I'm actually running slower now. Now I'm trying to do TDD, but it does come back up again. So if we can accelerate you through that, you start to see that productivity earlier, you're much more likely to stick to it and get all of the benefits, which I'll also go into. So you can do, I think no, actually I'm not going to do it now, but the original version for CppCon was going to be a 1-day version or a 2-day version. So you can stay just for 1 day or 2 days, but I don't think that really works for the online format. So I'll take that back. But maybe next year we'll do it that way again.
That's right. I forgot you had done that at CppCon 2019, right? Yeah.
And 2020? No,
I don't know if you
so
did.
20 must have been 2018 and 2019. Yeah,
Okay.
did it 2 years in person.
Right. Okay. Well, it's been great having you on the show today, Phil. It's always great talking to you. Where can people find you online? Anything else you want to plug on your way out?
So my website is levelofindirection.com. You know what's coming next. Yes. I do have extra levelofindirection.com that redirects there, as well as too many levels of indirection.com. Actually, I should check that's still working. I haven't checked it for a while. That's probably the best place to reach me. But you'll find me around anyway on all sorts of places. cpponc.uk, cppldn.uk for the C++ London meetup, cpp.chat when we get that back up and running again, and no diagnostic required.tv. So yeah, it's actually hard to avoid me these days.
How's the London C++ group going, by the way? Are you doing lots of online sessions?
Yeah, we've slipped from doing them every month. I'd say on average every 2 months at the moment. It's not a deliberate choice, just worked out that way. But we've been remaining online. The last meetup, I did run a poll to ask whether people were ready to maybe consider a small event back in person, maybe a hybrid event. There seems to be some interest, but it's by no means universal. So we're keeping an eye on that, and we may do a little hybrid event over the next month and see how that goes. But again, and I think it may just be one, and then we'll be back to fully online again for a few months. So it's a weird time at the moment.
That's an interesting point because, here in Colorado, my meetup has been willing to meet in person for several months, and it would be legal for us to do that and everything. But the companies that used to let us in to use their space aren't meeting in person at their companies yet. The offices aren't open. So we don't have a space to use, even if we wanted to go back to that without paying for one. I don't want to pay for one.
If there's any way to start doing some of these user group meetings outdoors where people might feel more comfortable. Of course, it's difficult to do a slide presentation or something like that outdoors, I guess.
By the sea, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's Phil. Like I said, it's been great having you on the show again today. Thanks for coming.
Been great being here. Thank you.
Thanks.